Hello.
Hey, Simon.
Hey, Simon, it's Skylar. How you doing?
Hello, Simon.
What's up, Simon?
Hello.
How you doing?
Hey.
Hello.
Hey,
Simon.
Hello, Simon.
Hello, Simon.
This is Conversations with Storytellers, a podcast of wisdom, thoughts, and folk and fairy tales from our elders, and I am your host, Simon Brooks. A meeting with professional storytellers. I decided to travel around the country when I could to interview some of the elders in the community of traditional storytelling. People who, for their work, travel about telling myths and legends, folk and fairy tales. Each storyteller shares their thoughts on our profession and gems of wisdom and, sometimes, a story or two. I'm glad you're here. I got in touch with Joel Ben Izzy years ago about a story for the National Storytelling Network magazine, Storytelling. He seemed like a nice guy, and other people who knew him affirmed that. Then a colleague, Heather Forrest, mentioned she had read his book, The Beggar King and the Secret of Happiness. I bought it and read it, and realised his voice needed to be on the podcast. We hit it off immediately, and the interview turned out to be quite long, at around 2 hours. So this is part one of the interview. Enjoy. So Joel Ben Izzy, thank you so much indeed for joining Conversations with Storytellers. I'm very excited. I've known about you for a long time, and we had interaction a while back when you submitted some stories for the National Storytelling magazine. I don't know, I'm looking at your face and you're looking puzzled, so you obviously don't remember.
I have a vague memory of that, yes.
And I've admired your work from afar. I've seen little bits here and there and everything. And then a good friend of mine, a good colleague of ours, Heather Forrest, told me about this book that she had recently read of yours, The Beggar King and the Secret of Happiness. And I bought it and I read it. And I was like, man, I got to have you on this show. Your story is phenomenal. So I'm very excited that you're here. And anybody that's listening, if you haven't heard of this book, then you should run out and buy it from your local brick and mortar store as soon as possible.
Should we actually pause the video to allow them to go out and do that?
Probably not. We'll let them pause it themselves. Depends on how far they are away from a brick and mortar store. They might be gone a while.
Yeah.
So welcome to the show, as it were.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And the reason you got the book is because Heather's son, Lucas, who she mentioned in her interview with you, he actually bought the house behind ours.
Right.
And we were just talking, and he said, what do you do? I said, I'm a storyteller. I said, oh, you know my mom? Heather Forrest. I said, oh my God, you're Heather's son. What a thing, you know? So anyway, then she came to visit, then that's how we reconnected after all these years.
Yeah, that's great. It's a small world, isn't it? The one that we live in as storytellers.
It seems to be. Well, I don't know if the world's actually small or if we make connections that make it sort of seem smaller to be able to get a handle on it.
Yeah, that's a true statement. Yes. I think that's probably what it is. And also the technology that we have these days allows us to, when the pandemic hit, it's allowed us to reach out far wider than before, I think.
I think so. Yeah. We end up doing this.
Yes.
Going the long way. That's a really great gesture on radio, isn't it?
It is. So Joel just put his right hand over his head and scratched his left ear. And as when we were at school, we would ask kids to do this, or it was a ritual, and we got asked to do it as kids. Is you would do that and then say "red" backwards.
Red backwards, red backwards, red backwards.
Yeah, exactly. But you would go "duh."
Oh, duh. Oh, duh. I see the error. It's an English thing. That's right.
It is. It's an English thing.
We would say HUD backwards.
Hot backwards.
HUD, which would be duh.
Oh, there you go. There you go. So there is a difference between the English language and the American language.
Two cultures separated by a common language, I think somebody said.
I think they did. I'm not sure who it was. Maybe Mark Twain. I don't know. Sounds like something.
It wasn't Yogi Berra.
It wasn't.
He made a point of saying, I never said half the things I said, so it wasn't him.
Like a lot of storytellers, I think we say the same thing too.
I never said that. That must have been another storyteller. So how did you get into storytelling? And how long have you been doing it for?
Sort of informally, I loved stories as a kid, and my I found my second grade report card where the teacher said, Joel is great with puppets and stories, but I don't think he'll ever hold down a regular job. And so that's been, but so while I've loved it, it was really about 1980 that I started doing this, and I fell in love with the art form then, and ended up designing a degree around it at college.
Oh, you designed your own degree? How'd you? Tell me about that.
I did. So I had, I started off at Stanford, and then ended up dropping out to travel and search for the meaning of life, which is what one does when one's in college or looking for that, that purpose, that sense of like, what the hell are we doing here? And I ended up back at UC Santa Cruz. And that's where I first saw someone telling stories. And that was about 1980 that I was at UC Santa Cruz. I had started at Stanford and dropped out to travel and discover the world. And at the time I was doing mime. So I was, and I was not a very good mime. I was doing mime in Paris. I was a mime who was much better at talking about mime than actually doing it. And the mime community frowns on mimes who talk a lot about mime. They go, and when they frown, it's one of those big frowns like mimes have. But that career was really going nowhere, and it got as far as an auto accident at 119th and Paulina on the south side of Chicago, which was the baddest part of town. I had formed a little tiny mime troupe. It was called the Real World Mime Troupe, which was a very aptly named troupe because all the friends I'd convinced to join it, we'd go do street theater and travel around the East Coast. They all had to drop out and get actual jobs. So it was just me and a guitar player, and we never made it past that intersection where we met Mary Rose Torres, who was driving a white Mustang about 30, and there was no stop signs, and bam, suddenly my hip was dislocated, and I got like really a crash course in understanding pain in a way that few men ever do. Women get the know about pain in childbirth, but a dislocated hip sort of suddenly is about as close as one can get. So on crutches, I hobbled back to California, with the help of a plane and some friends, and ended up there. And it was the winter of my discontent. I had an absolute broken heart because I'd fallen in love with somebody who was just completely wrong for me. She was the exact opposite of me. She was that unattainable blonde that I had no business dealing with. And what was I doing anyways? And she had just dropped me entirely. And I was, and I was crushed and trying to pursue my career as a writer at the time. And I was sending off things to magazines to think, I'll be a writer. That's my call. I'll write the great American short story, and sending these things off and getting them rejected. So there was that usual heartbreak. Do you ever see that cartoon in the New Yorker? There's the writer slumped dead over his desk, and there are two cops looking at his body, and one says, look, here's a suicide note. Oh, and the writer's over his desk, and there's all these rejection notices pinned up against the wall, and the cops look and say, look, here's a suicide note. He says, this is the worst suicide note I've ever read. So that was me. That was my career.
It took me a while to get that. And I was like, okay, no, yeah.
Things felt like they were crumbling in general, and everything was falling apart. And then it started to rain. And this was the once in a century rain that came to Santa Cruz, that we'd never had rain like this before. And so the rain was now pouring everywhere. It came and washed out the bridge in town, and then water was like falling through the ceiling. And my life was feeling like completely famished, completely torn to shreds, that all that angst and misery. And and in the middle of this, I thought back, the last time I'd seen the beautiful woman I was in love with, who was completely wrong for me, we had gone to a concert in Santa Cruz where we saw Robin Williamson, formerly of the Incredible String Band. And we had seen him do a concert the first half, and then he told a story for the second half. And my eyes just opened up wide. And he told the story of the mists and the loch and the grieguch and all that. And I suddenly had like a flash of insight. I said, oh my God, that's my calling. I am going to be a British storyteller. That's it. That's it. I'm going to have to get the accent. I'm going to have to get the history, the culture. And so there was that idea running in my mind, that potential British storyteller dream, Simon, which, by the way, you fulfilled that somehow.
I did.
I'm
not sure how I did, but I did. So I had this dream of being a Jewish storyteller, but that never came through.
Start with this way. Start. Oi. Start. Let's hear the oi. Come on, let's hear oi.
Oi.
No, with more feeling. Come on.
Oi.
No, a little bit slower, more feeling. Oi.
Oi.
Ah, good. Now try oi, gewalt.
Oi, gewalt.
And now hit the gewalt a little heavier. Gewalt.
Gewalt. Oi, gewalt.
That's beautiful. In Berkeley, we call this gewalt therapy. It's very good for you. It's very okay. So there I was, my heart broken. You wanted the truth, right? So this is the truth, unadorned. I'd seen Robin Williamson. I decided I wanted to be a British storyteller. And the rains were coming. They were falling through our roof. And I had run out of pots to catch the water in, right? And so I was using newspaper. And I opened the newspaper, and it said, Storytelling Center helps young storytellers. And I read about a woman named Ruth Marie Arguello Sheehan, who you've probably never heard of. And back in the day, what she had done, if you go back to the beginning of NAPS, which is now the National Storytelling Association, National Storytelling Network, NAPS is the National Association for Preservation and Perpetuation of Storytelling and Overuse of Too Long Acronyms, right? So NAPS was in Jonesboro, but Ruth Marie was in Santa Cruz, trying to build her own storytelling organization. And so this was a parallel one that never quite got off the ground the way the National Storytelling Festival did. So the American Storytelling Resource Center, this woman, Ruth Marie, had started this organization, and it was really out of her house in Santa Cruz. And so in the rain, on my bicycle, with just one leg pedaling, because the other one had been dislocated and had gone out in this accident, and so I couldn't use the other one. But so it was just one leg pedaling on my bike through the rain. I pedaled to her house, and I say, you got to help me tell stories. And she said, you're a mess. What happened to you? And I said, well, there was this auto accident in Chicago. There was this mime troupe, and it just went on and on. And I ended with saying that I want to be a British storyteller. She said, I don't know about the British storyteller, but maybe a Yiddish storyteller. I said, a Yiddish, that I could do. I mean, I read these Helm stories when I was a kid.
All right.
Helm stories, and those were like as easy for me as it is to be a British storyteller for you.
Right.
So she very kindly, she passed away just a few years ago, but she kindly agreed to sponsor an independent study at Santa Cruz in storytelling, in Yiddish storytelling. And I convinced one of the professors there, a playwriting teacher named George Hitchcock, to sign off on it. And I began to go back to the books I read as a kid. Tales by Isaac Bashevis Singer, Stories of the Fools of Helm, The First Schlemiel, The Elders of Helm and the Foolish Fish, and then The Joys of Folklore, and began to realize, it's the beauty of the Yiddish language that everything has a story to it. You know,
Yeah.
a schlemiel. A schlemiel is technically defined as somebody who falls on his back and breaks his nose.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah. And then you have to put it in context because our story is characters. So if you're in a restaurant, the schlemiel would spill the soup, and the soup lands on the schlemazel. So schlemiel is always playing soup, and the schlemazel is the one without luck. And then
okay.
The schlemiel
I thought you were going to say the ceiling or something like that.
No, the schlemiel. So schlemiel spills the soup, it lands on the schlemazel. Seated next to the schlemazel is the nebish, who says, "What kind of soup is that? That looks good." And then he looks over at the schlemazel, and he says, "I see that he fell on you and broke your glasses. You know, I could fix your glasses if I had one of those little pocket screwdriver kits, but I don't have one." That's the nebish. The nebish does that. And anyways, there are all these characters, and everything is a story. And suddenly, these stories were just easy and natural to tell
because they came from within.
I'd sort of grown up with this idea, and these characters, and this longing for this place.
So you read these stories. You said you read these stories, but were there people in your family that also read them or told you the stories?
You know, it's funny. I listened to your podcast in conversation with the storytellers, and I'm always struck by sort of the rich story milieu that people come from. Like I was listening to your interview with J. O'Callahan, House on Pill Hill, and all the rooms, and the people in orange cheeks, and I love Jay's, and I love his stories. And he just grew up steeped in the world of story. And then I was listening to Martin Shaw, who's somebody I've worked with over the years, who I just really admire. I know you met him for the first time, in the course of this interview. And again, this kind of magical other world. And I did not grow up in a world like that. I grew up in I think it was about the exact opposite of that. It was suburbs of Los Angeles.
Oh, wow.
Roads were all straight. And, so much of storytellers talk about the connection to the land, the connection to the place. And we had landmarks, way to the south was the 10 freeway, and way to the east was the 210 freeway. To the west, there was the 405 freeway, and then the mythical Hollywood 101. That so that was our landmarks, freeways, and then we would, when it was clear, we could see the mountains, but it was usually smoggy, so we really couldn't see them. And
was there a lot of smog when you were growing up as a kid?
There was. They said it was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But it did, you'd cut it and you'd pull out a piece of smog and be able to breathe. But it would fill in really quickly, so it didn't help much. That part's not true, by the way. I'm just exaggerating.
I guess. I think yes.
There was a lot of smog, and it felt like the least magical place on earth. And it's funny, I always have had kind of a jealousy of storytellers who'd grown up just steeped in the stories and songs. Like Michael Parent, these songs filled the air and had all these, and so, we were mostly struggling with trying to be poor and waiting for one of my father's inventions to catch on, which
that's right, because your father invented things that didn't quite catch on or were already invented. Am I right?
Well,
do I remember that right?
They were mostly ahead of their time, is the way it was. They were things that they were too early. Like for a while, he did real estate. This was like back in the 70s, and I remember him saying, in the future, we're driving clients around to show them open houses all the time, but in the future, people are going to be able to, when they want to look at a house, they'll look at a screen like a television, and it'll be like they're in the house. and they can travel through and they can see pictures of that. The technology just wasn't there and wouldn't be there for another 50 years.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
Yeah, he had more inventions that were just not quite at the right time.
And your mother, what did your mother do?
My mother had been a journalist. And
so there was writing in the family then?
There was definitely writing in the family. And she was a journalist, and what's more, she was curious about everyone and everything. And she would see people and wonder what the story was behind them. She'd come from Cleveland, where she'd worked in the Cleveland Plain Dealer as a reporter. And everyone she met, I remember we had like this old piano. And nobody was playing it, so she arranged to give it away to somebody. And like the man came and got it, and then she said, "I'm so glad he got it. I think he must be a recovering alcoholic." And I thought, how did my mom get that?
Yeah, how?
And she had just picked up those things. She had this sense of people, and would always ask them questions. And it was hard as she grew older because she was very hard of hearing. And I think it might have been the presses when she was in the newsroom at the Cleveland Plain Dealer that did damage.
Oh, yeah.
And so her hearing got worse as we got older. So she would ask these questions but not really be able to hear the answers.
Oh, that must have been awful.
It was really very hard. And sometimes I think if one could just sell irony on the wholesale market, you could make a very good living.
Yes, one could. I think there's enough irony to go around for free, though. That's the problem, right?
Or you have to pay someone to take it away, like hauling it. Could you haul away the irony?
Yes. Iron away the irony.
Right.
So you got the writing chops from your mother, right?
I did. I was recently going through some papers, and I found little stories she'd helped me write up when I was a kid. So she was very, very encouraging.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
So are you gonna share that at any point?
Those stories, they are really not hardly worth sharing. What's most meaningful about it is she would sit and type them up. You know what a typewriter is, yeah? Like an old-fashioned computer.
Yeah. My mom was a secretary.
Oh.
And so she ended up sometimes when they upgraded the typewriters, she would bring one of the old ones back home so that she could use it. And then we eventually got when she stopped doing that work, she would do freelance, secretarial work, and so she had an electric typewriter, and that was loud because you turn it on and click, and then chok 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 chok. So yeah, I know what a typewriter.
Remember Selectric typewriters with a little ball on them? Did you have those?
I saw them, but I didn't. I know of them, but I've never used one. But I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
magic. It's like instead of the keys going up, the little ball would spin around, and each time, and then they had two tapes, one black, one white. And if you wrote something, and you could do 3 lines of text. First of all, how the ball knows to turn the right way and press it. That's a miracle. Anyways,
right.
You decided to undo something, and then it would go backwards with the white one going back over the same thing to type liquid ribbon over what you just typed. It was just astounding. I don't know. It's a miracle, and then it's evolved the way it's gone.
Yeah, and now we don't even have that. Just have these waves that go through the world to tell computers what. It's crazy. Yeah, I mean
that and toasters. Toasters are amazing because you put in the bread. The toast comes out. No one knows what happens to the bread, where the toast comes from. It's a miracle, I tell you. Did we get off topic?
No, not at all. Not at all. So do you think, was there anybody else in your family that told stories, though? Did you have uncles or grandparents or aunts?
My father would always make jokes about them. And jokes are like stories that never quite got to grow up. You know, they're like the
like that.
yeah, and he would always find something to laugh at. I mean, if I remember, if I look back and say, what were the main gifts I got from my parents, I would say from my mother, curiosity, and from my father, humor.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. Yeah, humor is I think is so important. Or at least it has been in my life. It's like, it's something that, you know, my mom and I, we always, you know, my parents were divorced when I was 6, so I didn't see my dad that often. And my stepdad, well, we won't talk about him. But, you know, my mom...
Bruno? We don't talk about Bruno?
No, we don't. No, we don't talk about that. That did not happen in Las Vegas, so we don't talk about it. But yeah, it was, you know, so my mother and I and my brother, we had a good sense of humor just to get through a lot of the stuff that we had to get through, you know. So I think humor is invaluable in a story or in life in general.
That's what kept us going was humor. And there was a lot of illness. I think you read my first book, The Beggar, King and the Secret of Happiness. You didn't read the second book, which is called Dreidels on the Brain. And there's I sort of describe how my mother and father would take turns going in and out of the hospital.
Oh, really?
This treatment for that, treatment for thyroid cancer, for this, for that, and on, back and forth. And I described their treatment as being like our cars. That my mom was like the Dodge Dart, which is we kept on kind of fixing it up and it kept on running, but my father's was really more like the Belvedere station wagon, this green station wagon we had that like didn't quite have all the pieces to start with and just kept losing more pieces, and we kept adding things to try to fix it up, and eventually just, you know, had to haul it away to, you know, so somebody else could deal with it. And that was kind of like their health.
Oh, wow. That's not good.
No,
I love the humor that you put in that is like, that's really funny, but really it's not. It's
you know, Simon, you think we can't sell irony wholesale, but if we could mix it with some humor and make it palatable, would that business go?
It might. Maybe we could do that. I'll put a little tag at the end saying you can buy it here.
That's right.
www.ironyhumor.com or ironichumor.com.
Yeah.
And it'll just be a black page when people get there. Ah, dear. So you went to college, you left college, and you started your troupe, and then the troupe kind of ended itself, and you met this woman who says you could be a huge storyteller.
Thank you. I'm glad you can follow a storyline. Ruth Marie Arguello-Sheehan. And she was really a very kind woman and sponsored me on this independent study of storytelling. And then I did a little performance in my college. And it turns out that she was organizing her own storytelling festival. And this was, again, a parallel to Jonesboro, the American Storytelling Resource Center Storytelling Festival. This must have been like spring of 1980 at Asilomar, this beautiful conference center in Monterey.
Mm-hmm.
And she had invited famous storytellers to be there and to tell and workshops and the whole thing, when storytelling festivals weren't nearly so common. And I agreed to go help, like as an intern, to register people and do this and that. And then one of the tellers she booked did not show up.
That sounds like fate is coming.
It sounds like youthful hubris and arrogance is coming. And she turned to me and said, "Joel, you're a terrific storyteller. Why don't you step up and be the featured storyteller at this festival?"
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
It was a little crazy. She was really sweet, Ruth Marie, and a little There are reasons I've since learned why one might not do that, like multiple reasons. But I said, sure, I'll do that, thinking, all right, I know 11 stories, including the one about Ishlamil, Shlamazel, Nebesh, Nudnik, Schnur. I can, I'll do that. So I, there on the spot, sort of stood up and became the storyteller at this festival, and managed to get through it okay. And eventually I decided, I was at Santa Cruz and I was in the English department, and it was a time when the state universities were just being slashed and they were burning the furniture to stay warm there in it, which is silly because it's pretty warm anyways. But it was just barely alive. And Stanford, where I'd started, said, you could come back here, we'd give you your scholarship back, and you could do your degree here. So I ended up going back to Stanford and designing a degree, English, creative writing, and storytelling, and doing mostly independent study. And then I got the distinguished JB. You don't meet a lot of people with a JB at the end of their name, which stands for just barely in the diploma. That part's not true. But so I
BS.
Yeah, BS. That everybody does. So that was a degree, cobbled together around storytelling with little mythology in it and a lot of writing in it. And that's answer to your question, how I got started in this.
So, all right. So, what year was this then? When you kind of came out?
I finally graduated in 1983.
Okay. And who else was in your area that was telling stories at that time?
Well,
on the West Coast, there probably weren't that many, were there? It seems to me that they were all in the middle of the country or on the East Coast.
I think there were a lot known. The one particular who was at that festival, mm-hmm. and who really became quite an influence to me was Steve Sandfield.
Okay.
Do you know Steve, or did you know Steve?
I do not. No.
Yeah. So Steve was, he passed away recently as well, and he was. There are some storytellers you hear in life, and by virtue of their voice and something of their mannerisms, you can just repeat every story they tell. Or I don't know if you can. That's what I can, and not many like that.
Right. Yeah.
But Steve had a kind of a depth and a cadence, and he was a Jewish from New England, but roots in the old country. And he told these Yiddish stories, and he was somebody who I just instantly gravitated towards, and who I would see every few years at a festival, an event, or performance, and he'd always say something critical of what I was doing.
And what, you were performing at the same festivals, I'm assuming?
Yeah. He would always say something critical, mixed with something complimentary, but also critical. I remember I was once at a festival somewhere in California near Yosemite, and I had just come back from traveling and wove together this whole set of stories that I thought was just a beautiful mix of folk tales and personal stories, and it was really some of the finest work I'd ever done. And it was this kind of oleo setting where two different rooms and people are going back and forth, and I had a half-hour time slot, and it came in at 34 minutes.
Ooh.
And I said, "What did you think?" He said, "Too long." He said, "I don't care what you did. Too long. You never, ever, ever go over time."
Well, that's a true statement.
That is very true. And I've never gone over time since.
I bet, right?
Yeah. So he was just this sort of a wise, ascetic soul.
Yeah, he wasn't critical of you. He was.
No, he was. He was critical.
So he wasn't just dispensing advice. He was actually putting you down.
Not putting me down, but it was this sort of this mixed thing. And I don't want to make because there are people who will listen to this who knew him, and he was somebody who had an innate sense of what was right about a story. Sometimes he would do these story critiquing sessions, which could be very harsh. And then at the same time, he saw something in me as a young storyteller that was really good, and he wanted to develop. So he saw that potential, and he was someone who just had a way about him that could be gruff but also loving. And he was far from perfect, and he'd had like battles with alcoholism for a time. And I learned after he died that he was I saw him last year. He founded the Sierra Storytelling Festival, which is a beautiful festival. He's the founding artistic director. And I learned there that when I performed there, which was the last time I saw him, of his experience as a freedom rider down south, going to sort of on buses to towns to sort of with blacks and whites together to fight for the rights to vote. And I later learned, oddly, he was best man at Leonard Cohen's wedding.
Wow.
Odd. I had no idea, though. But to me, he was Steve Sandfield, the storyteller, and a big influence there.
That's really cool. So where were you telling stories primarily when you started telling stories? Was it at these festivals, or were there schools that hired you? Or
what I did first was after college. I never had a practical thought in my mind about this, about how I was going to make a living. I'd grown up poor and figured that something would turn up and I'd manage. And I came up to San Francisco, and over the summer there was a summer camp at San Francisco Jewish Community Center, and I went in and just told stories there to the kids at camp, and found that sort of word spread and sort of schools would ask me to come. And then I realized I had been traveling. I wanted to travel again. And I mentioned to a friend, his name is Urs Steiner. He's a conductor now from Switzerland, Kur. And I said, I'd love to travel and tell stories, but I don't speak all these languages. Well, he said, oh, but Joel, don't you know, they have in the world many international schools where they speak English. And if you were to go to these international schools, they would let you tell stories. And I said, oh, great. And I got a list of these. And I remember sitting down with a typewriter. We're back to the typewriter. I got a list of all these different schools in Europe I started with. And I said, I am a traveling storyteller here in California. I will be performing in, and then I left it blank right at the end of the line. And then I copied these off on the copy machine. And then with my typewriter, I will be performing in Barcelona. I will be performing in Rome. I will be performing in London. I will be performing in Frankfurt. And I just sent out all these letters, and I had no plans to go anywhere. But then based on who wrote back, then I sort of put together a tour. And of course, like Americans think about Europe, it's like, oh, Europe, it's not very big. So let's see. If I'm in Vienna one day, then I could probably get to Barcelona in 2 days from that. And then Paris isn't far from that. And, it's like running all over Europe. But then sometimes people welcomed me to stay for a long time. A camp in Rome gave me a job for a summer.
Oh, nice.
I just buy a one-way ticket and go to the next place.
We didn't have Google Maps in those days, so we had no idea how long it would take to get from one place to another. If you weren't from there,
idea. No,
right?
It's just, and you look at a map of Europe, and it doesn't look that big.
And the roads aren't straight like those in California.
That's right. Yeah.
They're not on the West Coast. They're all twisty, windy. When we moved to Boston, my wife and I lived in Portland, Oregon for about 5 years, and we moved to Boston, and I could never find my way around Portland until it took me about a year to get used to the grid system. And it's really simple. I don't know why I had a problem with it. But then when I got to Boston, it was like I could always find my way around all the twisty roads. And Sarah's like, how do you... And she was
Which is completely the opposite. Portland is like Washington, D.C. It's like all math, numbers, or the easiest place to look is Salt Lake City. You can look at a house and the address, and you can actually just tell who lives there from the address. I mean, it's amazing and where it is.
It's true. So what kind of, when you were telling most of the stories that you told, you just stories about your travels? Is that right?
Well, what happened was I gathered a bunch of folk tales that just I liked, and what happened was as I traveled, I found that the story, it's like a musician with a song. Sometimes the story introducing the song outgrows the song, and the stories to and from and on ways to the travels would outgrow the travels, and sort of one story leads to another. I'll give you an example here. Let's see if I have this in my pocket here.
Joel is digging around in his pocket right now.
I have some change. So a story you've probably heard told, no variants of. And by the way, use whatever you want on the podcast and cut out what doesn't work. But I guess you do that anyways. But one of the early stories that I loved was a King Solomon tale. Back in the old days of Jerusalem when Solomon was king, and in those days there was a bakery that baked the freshest, best-smelling bread. I mean, the smell from this bread would waft out through the ovens. It would wind through the marketplace. People would find themselves drawn in to buy this bread, or maybe just smell it and go on their way. And so one morning, it was a Friday morning, and a poor woman was standing in front of the bakery begging for coins and saying, Shabbat Shalom, which means Sabbath peace, but it's a not so subtle reminder. Shabbat is a time to give some tzedakah, some charity, right? Shabbat Shalom,
Okay.
Shabbat Shalom. And the baker comes and says, lady, what are you doing? What am I doing? I'm standing in front of your bakery, begging and smelling your bread. I know. I own that bread. And you smell the bread in my bakery, pay for it. She said, no, I didn't eat it. I just smelled. Yeah, I own the bread. I own the smell. You pay for it. It's a ridiculous case, but you don't need a reasonable case to start a fight. People gathered around, pushing, shoving, arguing. Finally, somebody said, Baker, if you think this one has to pay for just smelling the bread, take your case to King Solomon. He'll judge it fairly. And the baker said, that is exactly what I will do. And in those days, you didn't have to file any pretrial motions. He literally dragged her to the court of King Solomon and said, Your Highness, this woman has been smelling the bread in my bakery. I insist she pay. And those in the court laughed because it was ridiculous, but not Solomon. Solomon, the wise, said, never judge your case until you've heard all the facts. He said to the woman, is this true? Have you indeed been smelling this man's bread? She said, I'm a beggar. I was in front of his bakery. Everyone smelled his bread. I didn't ask if everyone smelled his bread. I asked if you smelled his bread. Yes, but must I pay for just the smell? Solomon thought for a time and said, this man is a baker. He makes his living baking this bread. And until he sells the bread, he owns the bread and the smell. You've just admitted that you smelled that bread, so it's only fair that you pay for the smell. And now the court grew very quiet. Solomon turned to the woman and said, how much do you have? She said, I'm a beggar. I have half a shekel. He said, that'll do. Then he turned to the baker and said, there, you've been paid. He said, I haven't been paid. She has to give me the money. Give you the money? Didn't you hear the coins? The sound of those coins for the smell of your bread. So it's a favorite story, one you've heard over the years, one I've told many times. But as far as how stories evolve and change, first I found variations of it. You know, in French, there was a clochard, a street person who was, much the same. His name was René, who had this situation which dovetailed with a clochard, the street person I came to know in Paris, and that sort of wove in with that story. There's a Japanese version that I found on the subways of Tokyo, Judge Ooka Etizen. And of course, the subways of Tokyo are kind of a wild place anyways, because the trains come. And I'd never seen this before. Have you been to Tokyo?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's astounding. They do this in Hong Kong too. The trains come and they open up and they like run on time, not just like switch watch time, but digital time. Like whoosh, the doors open and you go to Shinjuku Station, which is the largest subway station in the world at the time. It has like a population of 1.25 million just at the station. Everybody seems to ride the train at the same time. My friend who lived there said, that's the Phi Slamma Jamma hour. You don't go there. But everybody goes to ride, and you stand inside this subway car that is absolutely filled with people that just can't hold anymore. And as you do, people stand calmly waiting outside the door, and then the pushers come with gloves and push them in. And they actually push people in, and they look like mimes, sort of doing this kind of thing, pushing people in, and people do this everyday work. And then, beep, the doors close, and their hand fingers sticking out and coattails sticking out. Whoosh, on the next station. We got to the next station. The doors open. People spill out. They pick themselves up, pick themselves up, and I spilled out with everybody else. And I looked at me, and there was a book stand that said "Tales of the Japanese King Solomon."
Oh wow!
That's exactly what I said. I said, "Oh wow!" And there was this picture book of Judge Uoka Etizan from the Edo period, where there was again a similar story. This was about a poor woman who lived above a yakitori restaurant where all she could eat was rice, but she smelled the food and came time to pay, the same thing. So I was telling the story once at a school in Switzerland, and the fellow friend Chuck Kruger, who ended up going on to found the Cape Clear Storytelling Festival, which was near and dear to my heart. So Chuck was driving me home back to his house, and I had just told the story, and we were driving through this tunnel, a lot of tunnels in Switzerland, and this light flashed. I said, "Whoa, what's that?" He said, "Oh, that's a camera. I'd never seen this before. That's a camera that takes a picture of you, and if you're speeding, then there's no cop needed. It just you get a ticket in the mail that says, here's a picture of you. You were doing this many miles an hour, and you owe us 150 francs." I said, "Huh." I said, "Then you could send them a picture of 150 francs. If you did that, the Swiss police would then send you a picture of a jail cell saying, this is where you're going to end up if you don't pay." I said, "You could send them your picture to turn it into the jail cell." And we went back and forth on this for a while. And then he said, a friend of his was going through one of these tunnels, and he wasn't speeding, but the light went on, and he had some extra time, so he figured he'd go back around again and go through the tunnel, and this time smile and wave at the camera just to give some. And he did it again with a big smile, a big wave at the camera, and then the next week he got 3 tickets for not wearing his seatbelt.
Oh no!
And so then I was telling this somewhere in Amsterdam, and they said, in Amsterdam, we have a similar system, but a little bit different, which is when the light flashes and you get a letter in the mail, and they say, we have a picture of you driving and speeding, send us the money. And they find they get the money much quicker because most of the people who are speeding are men driving with somebody who's not their wife.
Oh.
And the threat of having the picture sent to them is enough to get them to pay fast. So it's this kind of one story leads to another, and I think that's always been kind of my delight, is the way the world of story and the world of life kind of mix together.
They do. Yeah, I'm a big believer of that. And the other way around as well, I've found, for me anyway, is that I'll latch onto a story. It just speaks to me for some reason. I can't figure out what that reason is, but it's a story that I fall in love with. It's a story that I know that I have to tell. And it's not until like a couple of years later when I'm like, oh, hang on. This was going on in my life. And I'm telling this story, and they go together really well.
Uh-huh.
And so it's kind of interesting that the stories that I tell are almost biographical.
Now you're seeing the advantage of this wholesale irony business.
Yes.
Irony plus humor plus point. I think one could make a living at this stuff.
We could. Well, I hope so.
So far. Yeah. But that was, for me, that was the case with the Beggar King. Because I had told that story for some years before I fell into it.
Yeah. That's another thing as well, right? It's like some stories we don't fall into them, we just tell them because there's something special about them. We don't figure out what it is. And then there are some stories that we can't tell. Like I've mentioned this before. It's like I love Beowulf. I've got 4 or 5 copies of it up on my shelf, different variants of it, and it's a story that I guess I haven't had the life experience yet to enable me to tell that story with heart and with authenticity, I guess. Because when I try and work on it, it's like it just doesn't feel right, and so I put it aside. But there are also stories that I've told, and I've kind of like, like the Parrot and the Merchant, the Rumi story. And I told it every once in a while, and it was kind of like, it's not a bad story. I like telling it. It's kind of fun, but I didn't tell it that often. And I didn't realize it was a story by Rumi. It was in one of these, anthologies. It was always listed as a story from Persia. And then I saw a picture book, and I was like, oh, I wonder what their resource is. And it was one of those rare picture books that actually has the resource at the back. And it said, this is from a poem by Rumi. And I was like, I love Rumi. I've read quite a bit of Rumi. Why haven't I seen this story? This would have jumped out at me. I would have known this. And so I wrote down the name of the book that it was from. I did a whole bunch of digging and delving. And I found this poem, which is like 40 pages long or something ridiculous like this.
Really?
Well, I think it's probably 4 pages of like full-size letterhead paper, and the story itself is probably a paragraph or 2, right? And it's interspersed throughout this poem, right? And I was like, oh my gosh! When you read the whole poem, then you get this in-depth knowledge about what the story is really about. And as soon as I read that, it was just like, oh my gosh, that's what this story is about. It isn't just about this; it's about our choices and freedom, and it's not just about clever birds tricking us, right? And when I read that, it was just like now it became one of my favorite stories to tell. And I was just
let's hear it.
I'm not going to tell it right now. We're interviewing you.
All right. I'm going to have to come and interview you later, because I'm going to want. And the first question is: so tell me about this Parrot and the Merchant. Very, very nice, friendly storyteller. First, you tease me with a story. You got this great story. I want to hear about the Parrot and the Merchant. And suddenly, it's like, no, back to you. All right.
So one of the things I think is really, really important about your story is the fact that it's not just about your passion of travel that has added to your story, and it's added to your repertoire, and it's added to your creative your creative input into your stories. But you also got you had a sickness with your throat.
That's true. Thyroid cancer. And that's when I was talking about falling into the Beggar King. It's funny because I remember, because it goes right to that, because I remember doing a workshop. It was for rabbinic students in Jerusalem at Hebrew University, sort of teaching them how to tell stories. And there was a moment, I'd sort of known of this story, which was from Elijah's violin, but there's different variations about how Solomon has his dream that his father comes to him and says, you must build a temple. And his father describes it in every manner and detail and how many cubits. He says, but this temple must be built using no metal, for metal is the stuff of war, and this is to be a temple of peace. And so this sets Solomon on a quest to find this worm, the shamir, little tiny worm that's the size of a grain of barley but can split stone. And I remember sort of describing at the beginning of the story, one moment it just kind of caught, because he ends up capturing Ashmodai, the king of the demons, who creates all these magical illusions while he's there. It seems like it's raining in the palace, but coins are falling through the air, and then they touch the ground and disappear. And suddenly the pillars in the palace one day turn to pomegranates, and Solomon opens one, and out comes a butterfly with blue wings. And he's infuriated by these illusions. So he says to Ashmodai, he says, before I set you free, he's held Ashmodai prisoner here for 7 years while he's built the temple. It's all done. He says, before I set you free, I'll ask of you a single question. And it's simply this: I am a great judge, known for my wisdom throughout the world. And yet I'm often called upon to distinguish between truth and illusion. Can you teach me something of the nature of illusion? To which Ajmodai, king of the demons, says, illusion. Is that what you wish, your highness, to learn the secret of illusion? No. I could never teach you the secret of illusion unless you were to remove your ring. You see, Solomon had a ring he wore that had been given to him by his father. Inside inscribed the secret name of God, the name no one knows to spell or pronounce. And Ajmodai said, yes, just remove the ring for an instant, and I'll teach you the secret of illusion. And Solomon asked his advisor to say, absolutely not. This is the king of the demons. The only thing keeping him here is the ring. But Solomon says, no, I'll do it. I am Solomon the Wise. And his advisor said, your highness, this is unwise. Don't tell me what's wise, right? Solomon was a little arrogant. Don't tell me what's wise. They call me Solomon the Wise. He says, I'll chain Ajmodai up on the far side of the room. I'll stand over here. I remove the ring just long enough to hear what he has to teach me about illusion. Whereupon he removes the ring, and a gentle breeze begins to blow. And the breeze is coming from Ajmodai's wings. For Ajmodai had wings of an eagle, and each time he flapped, he doubled in size from 8 feet to 16 feet, 32 feet, 64 feet, 128 feet. You do the math. He got taller and taller. He said, you fool, Solomon, you should never have removed your ring. With that, he reached down, plucked out the ring, and tossed it. Out the window. It flew over the desert, flew over the mountains, over the ocean, flew over deserts and oceans, finally landed somewhere in ocean and distance. And now it's your turn, Solomon. Kiss your kingdom goodbye. And he picked up Solomon, threw him out the other window. And Solomon flew over the city of Jerusalem, over mountains, over oceans, over deserts, and finally landed in the midst of a vast, endless expanse. And when he looked in a puddle of water, he saw his face, which was not the Solomon he knew. It was an old man. And so began the wanderings of Solomon as a beggar, a journey that would last a lifetime. So at some point in telling the beginning of that story, I got really into it, and I didn't know why. But now back to the story at hand. It was not until I found I had thyroid cancer, which I thought would make just a terrific story when I told it, because there was a needle that was this big, right? And like, why would somebody use a needle that big to test the thyroid? And it had begun with gout. It was just this odd mix of things that I thought. I said, Tali, to my wife, this is going to make the best story. Look, there's the gout, there's the needle, there's a dream about lifting a piano up, dropping on my foot because that was the gout. All these pieces. She said, Joel, this is cancer. I said, no, this will make a great story. And then when I woke up,
I know this is a horrible place to end, but in the way of all good cliffhangers, I really want you to come back and listen to part 2, where Joel finishes the story he was just telling and shares even more stories, a joke or two, can you imagine, and his process of creating and presenting a tale. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, be sure to check out other episodes. And if you think I should interview a certain folk and fairy tale, myths and legends storyteller, one of our elders, then please send me an email. You can find me and my work on Facebook and on my website at Simon Brooks Storyteller, and on Instagram, Simon M. Brooks. Diamond Scree? Yep, that's me, the English fella and storyteller. A shout out to Chris Jedd for creating and recording and letting me use the wonderful music for my podcast. His band is called Blackpool Mecca. Check them out. They're really good. You can help keep this podcast alive and support my craft by becoming one of my patrons and paying anything from $1 an episode that you enjoy to a regular monthly subscription. In return, you get extras, early release, and exclusive content on my work. www.patreon.com/Simon Brooks. If you can't join my wonderful tribe of patrons, then help me out by doing something you can do. I would be very grateful if you could leave a review on Podbean, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, wherever you found this episode. It doesn't take long, and it helps not just me, but others find and enjoy this podcast. Thanks again for being here with me. I know that there are a lot of other places you could be, and I really appreciate it. Until next time, be healthy, be happy, and share the stories you love. Cheers.
It's just a story.